Hi, everybody. So we are entering week 5 of the New Star Beginner Quilt course. Did I get that right? So this week we have our 16 blocks and we are going to sew them up into a quilt top and add borders. So I have the 16 blocks here laid out on my design wall. Now, if you don't have a design wall, this is something you can do on a blank space on a floor, or you can do on a bed is a great place to do it. So what I would look for within your blocks, if they have a scrappy element to them, is to make sure that none of the fabrics that are next to each other are matching if they have the scrappy element. Now, if it's not scrappy, like these blocks are not scrappy, if you did all the same blue fabric, then you don't really have to worry about it. But if it is scrappy, that's just a personal preference of mine to have all the fabrics flow nicely through the quilt so I don't have a clump of one fabric in the same area. So I'd even say if a fabric here is the same fabric as a fabric here, they're only one block away, I would probably change it. I don't have anything like that. I don't think. I've kind of rearranged a little bit to try to get the look that I'm going for. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sew the rows together. So we have row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. And this is just sewn exactly like your blocks were sewn, where you take the first square of your block and the second square of your block and sew them together right sides. So we're going to take our first block, and I do have some of these pinned because they've been up here for a while. And over time, sometimes they can fall off the board. So I just undid those pins. So we're going to take this block and we want to sew it to this block. And we're going to turn them right sides together. And we're going to sew along those edges that were touching when it was laid out. And we have, or should have, our nested seams here. This is a good time to see the nested seams. You have this seam going up and this seam coming down. And so as they bump next to each other, we are going to have them nest nice and perfect. So I'm going to start by sewing this top row together. And I am going to show you from this viewpoint sewing that row together, and then we'll take the camera to the sewing machine to show you sewing row 2 together at the sewing machine, the actual sewing part. Okay, our first 2 blocks are sewn together, so they go right back up here in this spot. I'm not going to actually put them up here. I'm going to grab my 3rd block in the row, and these are the edges that need to be aligned. So I'm going to take this block and I'm going to put it right sides together with block number 2 from the row. And I'm going to go sew those 2 edges together, and then we'll sew the last block from row 1 on, and then we'll move to the sewing machine. Okay, here we are. We have first block, second block, 3rd block, and our 4th block is still up here. You can kind of see if I lift it up. So we are going to take the 4th block and sew the edges that would be next to each other, just like we did on the first 3 blocks right here. So flipping right sides together. I mean, I think you guys get this. It's kind of an awkward thing to demonstrate this way, but I want to be very clear how you put that together. So it's always the edges that are next to each other within the row that are being sewn together, flipping right side together, and nesting all of those seams. Okay, so I have all of my blocks for row 1 sewn together. I'm just going to pop it back up here in the same spot that it was. it's going to be shorter than my other rows because those seam allowances remove 1/2 inch at every seam for the whole width. So we took off 1.5 inches of fabric. So I did pin that up. It's a little bit harder to hold when it's like a big piece of fabric. There's more weight to it. So now we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew these together, those rows, and then we'll sew all the rows to each other. After you sew your rows together, you can iron these vertical seams connecting them. On each row, you want to flip the direction of the seams, which way you're ironing them. So on this top row, this vertical seam connecting each block, they are all ironed in this direction. So the seam lays pushed towards this direction. On this row, I'm going to iron all those seams in the opposite direction, and then I'm going to continue with each row, ironing them opposite from the row above, so that when I sew the rows to each other, they are all nested as well. The reason we want nested seams, we want when our seams connect, one seam goes one way and one seam goes the other way. I probably should have explained this earlier in the course, is because we want the quilt top to be as flat as possible when we are quilting it and to have as few layers as possible. If you have two seams going in the same direction that are sewn together, that means there's 4 layers of fabric there and it's just a lot thicker. Your needles can break easier, or the machines will stall or slow going over all of those layers. So that is the reasoning behind nesting all your seams, and why I keep mentioning it when we're sewing blocks together, is because we want that quilt top to be as flat as possible and to have as few thick seams as possible for quilting. So let's go to the sewing machine and sew the next few rows together, and then we'll come back here, have all the rows laid out, and sew the rows together for the whole quilt top. Okay, you can see I have my first block from row 2 and my second block. A good tip to remember is take a picture of your quilt laid out, wherever it's laid out, on the floor or a bed or the wall, to remember where all of your blocks go exactly, and then you can reference that. If you walk to your sewing machine and can no longer see your layout, you then can just take a quick glance at the picture on your phone to double check that your quilt blocks are staying in the correct place within the quilt. I have definitely sewn blocks in the wrong space in a quilt before when I haven't double checked and have forgotten. So always good to double check in case you forget. So what I'm doing is I am sewing the block together, making sure my seams nest at each intersection, and I'm just doing that by feel with my finger. But if you aren't sure how that feels, it's always good to visually check them. I am backstitching at the bottom and the top of connecting my blocks because I like that little bit of extra strength, and it's just 1 or 2 stitches. And so then I have my 2 first quilt blocks in row 2 sewn together, and we will iron this whole thing after we get the other 2 quilt blocks sewn to it. So let me grab those. I have the next quilt block in our row 2, and something that you could do if you want to bring all the blocks to your machine at one time is stack up your rows, taking the first block, stacking it, all of your blocks stacking right side up. Stack the first block on top of the second block, and then on top of the third block, and then on top of the fourth block. If you always stack your blocks in the same layout from left to right, left block on top, right block on bottom, you will always know what order your blocks are in. That's another way to keep track. You can also label your blocks or your rows. You can actually buy notions for this, like little patches that you pin on or you can just do a sticky note or a piece of paper with numbers and pin those to your blocks as well. But keeping track is always a good habit to make. So we have our third block in our row 2, and just over here to my left I had my last block stacked. The New Star quilt is pretty easy to remember where blocks go. Like I said, when we are looking at layout, the only thing that could mess something up is if you are doing something scrappy and you don't want to have the same fabric next to each other. But in general, it's very easy to keep track because each block is different than the block next to it. If you also want to pin these blocks together, because as we start to get into longer seams, that might be helpful. So you could pin the block at the bottom, and then you could pin it at each intersection, always checking those nested seams as you come to them though. We are going to pin our rows together as we're sewing, because that is a really long seam. And also probably we will talk about pinning the borders. With a quilt like this where we have a seam at every little square, it's not overly necessary to pin because we have those seams that we need to nest along the way that will help us. But if we had a long border that was a single fabric, we would very much want to pin it. I talk a little bit about that in the blog post as well. Okay, so you can't see the whole thing quite, but we have our row put together. So let's go iron it, and then I'm going to sew together rows 3 and 4, and then we'll sew all of our rows to each other to make our quilt top before borders. This is our row 2, and for row 1, we had all of our vertical seams connecting our blocks iron in this direction. So on this block, we want them to go in the opposite direction. So we want to come this way. Now, it's always good to remember which way they're going to go from the front, but we do have to turn it over. So if that can get confusing for you, you can hold your seam on that vertical spot in the direction that we want to iron it, so that when we flip our quilt top over, we're holding it in the direction that it needs to be ironed, and then we know which direction once we flip it over. And you might not have to do that, but sometimes it's confusing because it's actually going in the opposite direction when we flip it over onto the back side. Okay, so very much like when we iron the blocks, we're just kind of starting from the opposite direction of which way we want that to go, and we're just moving it towards the direction we want the seam to face. If you ever see any of your other seams starting to pop up or get out of place, just give it a quick iron. I'm just going to slide this down, and I can continue ironing these vertical seams between blocks, all in the same direction. Let's grab a different vantage point. Moving the block down again for our last seam. And this almost fully fits on my ironing board, but not quite. So just kind of getting a little bit different view here, ironing those seams. Just making sure that you're just not lipping any of these other seams up, since we have a lot of seams coming together. And then we can go put this row 2 on the design wall underneath row 1. So we have our row 2 sewn. Oops, it's upside down. For a minute I had a panic. The blue was aligning with the blue, and I was like, that is not correct. So we have our row 2. And you can pop a pin in the middle too. Sometimes it gaps a little bit. I'm going to go and sew together row 3 and 4 in the exact same manner and iron the seams so that they nest. And then we're going to sew our rows together. You can see again how much we shortened here. So that happens as our seam allowances decrease the size of our blocks from horizontally, and then it's gonna decrease in height as well when we sew our rows together. This is me stacking the blocks, but I stacked block 1 on top of block 2, and I grab block 2, and then I stack them on top of block 3, and I grab block 3, and then on top of block 4. So this is how I'm going to carry it to the sewing machine, knowing that this is my top block, and it is my farthest left block. So therefore, I can easily sew my row together from this stack of blocks without worrying about where they go in the row. Now row 4. A little bit wonky because they're not laying super straight, but that's what I'll work out once we sew them all together. So we have to sew our rows together. So we want to sew these 2 edges together. So we're going to flip this one down right sides together and then sew along this edge. Now I'm going to pin this because it's so long, and pinning can help just keep everything together and aligned because we have very large pieces of fabric we're working with. And as we sew them all together, it's going to be more fabric than you've ever had sewing together yet, I would assume, if you've never made a quilt before. So it can be a little bit heavy and pull, and pins will help us a little bit. So we're going to go to the cutting table this time to pin, and then we'll go to the sewing machine to sew rows together. Totally fine if you don't have a space big enough to lay out your whole row. I just wanted to lay this out so you could see. We do want to have pins. This is my magnetic bowl. It's awesome. Lint will still fall out, or you might have them in a pin cushion. So you just want to keep that to the side. We want to pull our row 1 down face first on top of row 2, keeping these 2 edges aligned. I know as I'm going along sewing the seam, I'm going to be nesting my seam. So I'm not overly concerned about everything aligning. I just want to keep it pretty even and easy to maneuver. So I'm going to just put a pin at the beginning and at the end. That will get me started. And I'm just pinning those 2 pieces together. And then I'm going to actually work on nesting the seams between the blocks and making sure they're nested and pinned. That will be 3 additional pins. That will keep everything pretty well aligned and easy to nest in between and not super unmanageable at the sewing machine. You can do more pins. You could go ahead and pin every nested seam so it's just easy as you're sewing. I don't think that's necessary. We're going to take this to the machine and feed it through like this, with this edge aligned with our 1/4 inch seam allowance mark or the edge of our foot or our foot guide. And as we're sewing, we're going to be pulling out those pins when we come to them. So let's hop over to the machine and take a look at that. We are ready to sew at the machine. We have this first pin in here, and we want to be careful where we place that when we pin it, but also as we start to sew, we want to bring over whatever we're holding our pins with so that we can place them in. And you want to kind of put all of this extra material from these 2 pieces in your lap, because usually your machine is pretty close to the edge of your table, and you don't want the weight of that material to drag and not feed through your machine nicely. That can happen sometimes if it's too heavy. So we're going to pop it under our foot, the same 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to start sewing. If your needle is going under your foot, you want to take that out before you start sewing. Mine's a little to the side. I could sew a little bit farther. I definitely want to pull it out before I'm going to sew over it. And then I start just to nest my seams and hold it with my finger as it gets pulled through. I did backstitch at the beginning of this long seam because it's the edge of the quilt before borders. And then this is just like sewing the blocks together or sewing the actual pieces of the block into a block. And you're just, as you hit those seams, making sure they're nesting. These seams that are pinned in between the two blocks should already be nested and pinned in place, so you can just continue going. And pay attention as you move from block to block. You potentially will shift directions of your seams on the top and bottom block, like I did right there. So you want to just keep that in mind, so that if any of the seams on the bottom are pointing towards your foot, there's a possibility for them to be pushed back at some point, and we just want to be cognizant of that so that they stay as flat as possible. You can see my pin here has started to pop out, which is fine. It's just holding it together more in the general area. Pins can sometimes do that, which is another good reason to potentially have clover clips. And I'm not really sure why I said another good reason, because I don't know that I've mentioned them before. Clover clips are these little clips, and they hold pieces of fabric together. They're a great tool to have too, and can be better than pins in some instances. Backstitching at the end again, and then we have 2 rows sewn together. We have our 2 first rows all sewn together. Now the pattern says then to sew row 3 to row 2, be doing the same thing, flipping these 2 right sides together and sewing along. There's another way you could do this. If that feels like a lot of fabric to work with, you could sew row 3 to row 4 in the same manner we sewed row 1 to 2. And then once you have this connected, you would sew this last middle seam. It doesn't really matter. All the seams are going to nest and they're all going to fit. So whatever makes you feel more comfortable, you can choose to sew in that way. I will do it either way half the time. The other thing that you can do, and I probably should have explained this prior to sewing blocks and rows together, just like I demonstrated chain piecing an individual block together, you can chain piece the whole quilt together. So I'm going to actually sew this row 3 to the bottom of row 2 now, and then we'll take a peek and then sew our last row on after that. Okay, we have 3 rows sewn together, 1, 2, and 3, and now we're going to sew on the 4th. I just wanted to note, I have not ironed these horizontal seams that I'm sewing the rows together yet. I usually save that for the very end and iron them all at once, all going in the same direction. So let's sew on row number 4, and then we'll have all of our blocks sewn together, and we can move on to the next video for our borders. I brought you with me for this last border because I just wanted to demonstrate it's a lot of extra fabric over here. So this is the left side of my quilt. I have the 3 rows that are sewn together on top. And I did not pin this. I probably should have. It's a lot of fabric to manage at once. So the more you do this, the better you will get at it. And if you're quilting this at home in the next couple of weeks, you will learn how to manage all this fabric even more. So I'm just kind of putting as much on the table or on my lap as possible, and that helps the weight fall higher, I guess, so that it doesn't have any lag when it's pulling the fabric through. I have had heavy quilts fall down and then they kind of skew the seam because the weight of it is harder to get through with the feed dogs. That sentence was not proper English, I don't think, but I think you get my drift. And since I didn't pin it, it is a little bit more wayward, like kind of crazy over here, I guess, that just pulling the top and the row are kind of pulling apart more. So I definitely recommend pinning. Sometimes if you are comfortable switching the direction and having the smaller row, like the row on top and the actual larger quilt top essentially on the bottom, like the more rows sewn together on the bottom, I find that helps a lot. It can be a little bit confusing if you're completely switching the way you're sewing together the quilt top though, so we did not do that for you guys this time. And of course, with this much fabric, just making sure that there's nothing bunching up underneath and catching under your seam. I've had that happen in a long ago time, closer to when I was beginning quilting, but I've caught part of my quilt top in the seam because there's so much happening. It's hard to keep track of. So just, oh, and see, I did run out of bobbins. Okay, we are back on track. If you ever run out of bobbin in the middle of a seam, just start back from where it ran out an inch or two and do a quick back stitch and then just keep going. You don't have to start that whole seam over again. And this is sewing fast. Remember, I sew a lot faster, I think, than a regular machine. This is probably more of a normal speed and maybe even a little bit fast for a beginner because this is just a fast machine in general. So keep that in mind. These seams don't take the timing of the video as how fast it should take you. Just take your time, have patience, and so I have been sewing for at least 30 years, and if you are new to this, it will take a little bit of time to catch up. I always try to remember to tell that to my children. They're like, why are you so good at this? I'm like, because I've been doing it forever. So let's go back to the board. But we have all of our 16 blocks sewn together. That's amazing. Actually, let's go to the ironing board first and iron those horizontal seams. Okay, we're at the ironing board and we just have to iron the horizontal seams holding the rows together. They go across the whole quilt. And typically I like to iron from the top going towards the bottom because that tends to be the natural way the quilt falls, or as you're sliding it across maybe a backing. That seems to be my normal go-to, is ironing the last seams of the quilt going top to bottom if I can. And I just spread as much of that horizontal seam across my ironing board as I can, and then iron as much as is available, and then just pull it farther down to iron more. All right, I just straightened it out a little bit there because part of my seam I need to iron was getting close to the edge. But yeah, just ironing as much as is on top of the ironing board and then shifting it down and ironing the rest is really how I do it. And then we're going to shift it up to the next horizontal seam after that. I'm going to pop my iron behind me. And then we're going to move it up to the next seam. And I'm going to move my quilt all the way in that direction so that I can pull it in the direction I'm standing. There, you can see more of it that way. So I'm starting over here on this edge, again, keeping it ironed, pressed in the same direction as the one I was just doing above it, and sliding it down. If you have a big iron, sometimes you will only need to slide it once to get the whole quilt ironed across. Doesn't take much, just wanting to make sure you are not re-ironing any of the other seams that are already supposed to be laying flat. If you decide to send your quilts to the long arm, you want to make sure these seams are just as flat as possible. And if your quilt top has been sitting around for a little bit, give it one last press. Your long arm will be much likely to want to quilt your quilts if your quilt top is pressed very nicely. But we are going to talk about how to quilt your own quilt on your domestic machine and a little bit by hand, because I do think I'm going to quilt this specific quilt top by hand, but I will have another quilt top to share with you for quilting by machine. Okay, if you're hanging on a design board, you may need a few more pins because it will sag a little bit. I did overlap. Here we go. So we have all 16 blocks put together, so that's exciting. Hopefully we can see them all there. So all 16 blocks are put together. If you are not adding a border, you could totally stop at this point and work on basting your quilt and quilting your quilt. We'll learn about those in the upcoming weeks. If you are adding the HST border, you will need, for the cover quilt size, 80 HSTs and the 4 square corner pieces, and they're just squares like from the block. So check out the other video for this week, and I will show how to lay out a border and how to sew it on.